The Jeff Gabriel Connection.
Hey Sheldon, how you doing?
Very well, Jeff. How about you today?
I'm doing good. Was actually looking at a lot of the material that you sent me, some of the things that are really passionate you in your studies and what you talk about. I felt like I was getting prepared for a final exam in college, and it brought back a little, PTSD a little bit. I was like, wow, this is a lot of information. I got like notes laying out all over the place, and I actually felt like maybe one of your students in your class. But to those that are listening or that will be listening, Sheldon Solomon is here with us today. And I was looking for someone on this subject matter. And when I came across you, Sheldon, I was just wowed by listening to you, wowed by your presence and your passion for what you do. Sheldon Solomon is a professor at Skidmore and a recent author of the book, The Worm at the Core, The Role of Death in Life. A heavy subject, but Sheldon really brings some levity and lightness to it. And it's really my pleasure to have you here today. I'm really excited to talk to you and thank you so much. A lot of this stuff, why I was reading it and studying it and going through numerous videos, a lot of the things hit home to me. I think the one thing I want to ask you first is, what was a pivotal point in your life? I mean, obviously you were studious, you were going to be a professor, I'm sure, but where was the crossover point for you where you became connected and passionate about death denial, this subject matter?
Wow. All right. Great question, Jeff. And I'll be honest, because throughout my professional career has basically been a series of accidents. At no point in my life did I say I want to be a professor and I want to study how conscious and unconscious death anxiety influences people. Rather, I've just two things happened to me, and one was personal and the other was an accident. On the personal front, I realized when I was 8 years old or so that I was extraordinarily disinclined to die. And that's when I realized very explicitly that I was going to die in the aftermath of my grandmother's death. And so she died, and the next day I'm like, oh man, that's a downer. But my mom, that means she's going to die someday. And then I was like, holy moly. I used to collect stamps, and I was looking at the stamps of the dead American presidents. I'm like, there's Washington, he's dead. There's Jefferson, he's dead. And I'm like, wow, you don't need to be a logician to extrapolate over time and recognize that there's going to come a moment when you're on deck to tumble into the existential abyss. And so this is very personal to me. I've not been a fan of dying since very early on, but then I never thought about it. I go on, I get a PhD in psychology. I get a job at Skidmore College, and I'm stumbling around the library looking for Freud to teach personality theory. And I bump into books by this guy I never heard of, Ernest Becker, who was a cultural anthropologist. And, in our library are these three books: The Birth and Death of Meaning, The Denial of Death, and Escape from Evil. And I'm like, wow, these are funky titles. And so I grab The Birth and Death of Meaning, and Becker in the first paragraph says, oh, I want to understand why people do what they do. And I'm like, yo, me too, dude. What a straightforward question. After 10 years of getting a PhD, just pummeled with jargon and terminology, non-pharmacological interventions for insomnia. And now all of a sudden, this Becker dude is, I just want to understand why people do stuff. And then
how old were you at this time?
I was 26. So I'm basically right out of graduate school. I have a PhD, unscathed by knowledge, a method in search of a question. Right. And I don't mean that cynically. It's just we were very well trained, but we didn't really know what we wanted to use our training for. And so that now Becker in The Denial of Death says that, it's the uniquely human awareness of death and our inability individually as well as culturally to accept the reality of the human condition that is the motivational impetus for everything that people do, whether they're aware of it or not. And
Right.
I read that and I'm like, in my gut, I was like, wow, dude, I guess I really don't want to die, but I'm not the only one. And so,
Well, I just want to add one thing to that as we go along. I want to add a couple little
yeah,
personal
jump
tidbits.
in.
What happened to you at 8 happened to me like around 6 or 7. And I remember sitting on my mom's lap asking her about what death was and that I didn't want to die, and her comforting me that I had a lot of time and a lot of long life. And this is something that I shouldn't be focusing on. And also the time frame, how old you were when you came across Ernest Becker around 27, 28 years old, is a lot of time, I think, when people cognitively light up. And maybe it was timeful that you bumped into him. I think you were probably ready, because around that time in my life, I started opening up the things that were like, what's going on? Anyway,
Yeah.
back to you. Sorry, man.
No, that's a great point, and jump in anytime and all the time, Jeff, because I do think this is important for folks that might be listening, because, on the one hand, it's just anecdotal. I'm saying,
Right.
I was 8 or 9 and I got hit with this existential pile of bricks. You're saying that you had a similar experience.
Yeah.
And the fact of the matter is that there's a large clinical literature that shows that young kids are much more aware of and concerned about death than their parents think.
Mm-hmm.
And this is important, because if you ask most parents, what are your kids in first grade more afraid of, their next spelling test or dying? Most parents say, oh, it's the spelling test. My kid doesn't even know what death is. But if you ask the kids, there are many existentialists way early, because kids say, I don't really care that much about spelling, but I wouldn't be particularly pleased about having to die. And so kids
So kids are that connected to that heavy, potential, exit.
Oh, absolutely. And
Wow.
that's
Wow.
because they're not thoroughly inculcated with the defenses that most of us are subsequently able to deploy later in life. And so this is a great point, because Becker's point is that in order to manage the anxiety that's engendered by the awareness of death, we ardently embrace our culturally constructed beliefs. And it's from cherishing those beliefs that we get a sense that life has meaning and we have value. But for kids, they're in the middle of being attached to their parents. And of course, that never changes, but they're not yet fully embedded into the cultural worldview that they will later subscribe to. And so it makes sense developmentally that anywhere between age 2 or 3 and 8 or 9, that these existential concerns are apt to arise.
Right. Is it heavier when they're younger? I mean, what does it dissipate a little bit in the teenage years or latter teenage years, and then come back, like when you start actually aging and maybe seeing yourself age a little bit?
I think so. So now, again, you don't need me. You're making great points, Jeff, because right now the developmental psychologists, they've like added another stage to human development. And I think they call it early adulthood. And it's right about the 26, 27, 28 marker that you tossed down earlier. And whether or not this is a cultural affectation that's, just part of our current history, or whether or not it happens universally, I'm not prepared to say. But I do know that in our culture, we're pretty much culturally constructed meat puppets till we get out of college. It's not that we don't have our own autonomous identities, but I think for a lot of us, myself included, I needed a couple of years of distance out of college, so the psychodynamic mist could settle a bit, in order for me to differentiate between who I really am and who other people wanted me to be. And that's, I thought, what contributed to my own transformation when I encountered Becker's books at that age. It really, kind of kneed me in the psychological groin when Becker asks us to consider at all times in our lives how much of what I'm now doing is a genuine reflection of who I am and who I would like to be versus how much of what I'm doing is an unconscious effort to minimize death anxiety by adhering to standards that are not ultimately my own. And all of us have these existential excruciations, but and this doesn't make us better humans, but it does make it somewhat different. And so,
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's really interesting is how much of this is, how much is this is subconscious, and how much are you really consciously, paying attention to during your day, especially, someone that's in their 20s is just trying to figure it out and fit themselves in culture. And one of the things that you spoke about, one thing was passionate that we talked a little bit about last time we spoke was, self-esteem as an anxiety buffer, and why self-esteem, is hard to come by, and also how we build self-esteem to sort of build ourselves into this cultural construct. We build ourselves into something, and I'm not sure how we do it, but we build ourselves into something to give us a sense of foundation and a sense of purpose and a sense of connection. And maybe you can elaborate a little bit on that.
Yeah, no, nicely done. So, Becker's point is that all of us, it is a universal human yearning to want to find life meaningful and to perceive ourselves as valuable in the context of that meaning system. And maybe that's just common sense masquerading as existential insight. But that's one of Becker's core claims, is that in order to stand up in the morning, we need to think that life has meaning and that we have value. But the point that Becker makes that is important, Jeff, is that you can't feel valuable in the absence of a culturally constructed standard of what it means to be good. So for Becker, self-esteem is the belief that you're a person of value in a world of meaning. Mm-hmm. But that means the way that you get self-esteem depends upon the culture that you subscribe to. And we talked about this last time around. What makes it tough to be an American right now is that we all want self-esteem, but the standards by which we are taught to judge ourselves are not realistically attainable by the average individual. All right. So
right.
if you're a good American, we're taught that you should be rich and powerful. Moreover, we're taught that the American dream is such that anybody who is sufficiently intelligent and sufficiently motivated will be successful. Therefore, by inference, if you're not successful, it is by virtue of your own deficiencies. And this ignores the fact that economic mobility in the U.S. is almost non-existent. You're more likely to get out of poverty in Canada or Bangladesh than you are in the U.S. So we have an entire generation of people thinking that they're failures by virtue of embracing a standard that is unattainable. It's even worse for women because they're supposed to be rich and famous, and they're supposed to be thinner than pieces of linguine and never be more than 25 years old. And so, and moreover, they have to look at pictures of pretty women in fancy magazines, all of whom have been photoshopped to be 20% thinner than it is humanly possible to become.
It's such a huge undertaking as a person, just to find your way within that self-esteem, to fit in and fit into culture. Yes. It's something that, as a person when I was in my mid and later 20s, it's something that, you're not even aware of it in front of you. It's
That's
like
correct.
it's really deep down, and you're trying to figure out like and make me feel. And then I think just related to what you're saying, the unrealistic pursuits that we have is more difficult than ever because the digital mirror is so freaking large and pronounced and just jamming you in the face all day long. I mean, you really have to have your wits about you and have enough experience and been through enough to disconnect, to be able to refine yourself. I mean, that's how I feel about it.
Yeah, no, brilliantly put. It is a recipe for psychological despair. And your point's a good one. It's compounded by the fact that everything is now mediated by the virtual and digital world. So on top of having to be successful in the sense that us old timers are familiar with, you're not even consequential until you have like 1,000 Facebook friends. And if you have to do something interesting, it doesn't count until it's posted.
But why beyond the dopamine hit of every like that you get on your Facebook page, that following that people crave within the construct that you're talking about do you think that is a relief mechanism for death denial?
Yeah, it is, but so's heroin and Fox News and white bread. In other words, there are mind-numbing, lobotomizing ways to blot out death anxiety. That's why Ernest Becker, at the end of The Denial of Death, he says, everybody these days is either drinking or shopping, which is the same thing. So one way to deny death, the philosopher Kierkegaard, he said that we tranquilize ourselves with the trivial. And that really sums it up. But the argument is that there are better ways to do this, better in the sense of being more uplifting psychologically, as well as being better for the culture that surrounds us. And so that's the wrap on self-esteem these days. It's not that self-esteem itself is unfortunate, although we got to carefully distinguish between self-esteem and narcissism, because those are the opposite. We confuse and conflate them in our culture. We are a pathologically narcissistic culture. And so to have high self-esteem in a culture that values narcissism is to put one in an unfortunate position, because you actually literally have to behave in a narcissistic fashion in order to feel good about yourself. And that has unfortunate consequences.
No, that's really important that you say that. And let me tell you when it happened to me. I was in 9th grade or 10th grade, and I watched MTV, and it flipped me completely upside down. All of a sudden, I'm in my own world. I have a reasonable mirror reflection of what's going on, and all of a sudden, it goes from what you're talking about, self-esteem, into now, well, wait a minute, if I'm going to interact with people, I mean, it might be a bad example, but it definitely changed my psyche a little bit. Now, all of a sudden, I'm like, well, wait a minute, I got to get on the side of that screen if I want to have another relationship with people and have a fun time. It doesn't necessarily need to be a rock video, but all of a sudden, it starts pulling people to the narcissistic side. And our social media and our media footprint right now is all that. And it's effing up people big time.
Yes. And again, you said it better than I, Jeff. We have.
Oh, don't lie! Don't.
No, we've put ourselves and our children in the unfortunate psychological double bind of asking them to embrace standards in order to procure self-worth. That, in so doing, ultimately undermines their self-worth. And so we might have talked about this last time around. There's a guy, his name's Michael Sandel, and he's a professor at Harvard, and he just wrote a book about it's something like, what are the problems with meritocracy? And it's a brilliant book, because he's like, look, we live in a world where we're saying everybody needs to be equal and we should be judged solely on merit. Yeah, and that sounds great until you step back a bit and think about what that means. And his point is that, yeah, we live in a culture where the only thing that matters is being the absolute best in whatever you do. But by implication, that means if you're not the best, then you're a failure.
Right.
And what an incredibly unfortunate, almost psychotic world we have created, where there's only
Hmm.
one position in every domain for someone to be psychologically exalted, where for most of human history, we didn't value whoever was best. We honored them, and as we should, because we would be proud as members of a community to have somebody with great ability and even someone of heroic stature. No,
Right.
that's great, and we're all for it, but only in a world where everybody could feel good about themselves for merely being a decent human,
Hmm.
fulfilling your obligations in the context of your social role. That's why Jimmy Carter, you may be too young, Jeff, but Jimmy Carter, gets a bad rap as president. And yet in the 1970s, Carter said, we're about to encounter a psychological disaster because we keep promoting the value of money and stuff. Remember,
Hmm.
Reagan gets elected and immediately takes the solar panels off the White House and declares that greed is good. Right,
Right.
right after Carter said that's the wrong direction. We need to be concerned about enhancing meaning and value for everyone. We need to create a cultural context where self-esteem can be acquired by merely behaving in a decent and virtuous fashion. And I would submit that the world would be quite different 5 minutes after we did that.
Right. I think the other problem is that people have a hard time figuring out, how can they just disconnect from this and just look at these people that we're supposed to honor and not conflate it by saying, I should be that person. And
Yes.
everybody's running around saying, I should be that person. And what you talked about self-esteem, which is really a requirement and a buffer to help you with the anxiety of dealing with the potential that we're going to die, the inevitable one day. I mean, it's hard for people to build that, that soft bubble around us that actually emotionally protects us. And now I recognize by what you're saying why so many people are having a really, really hard time.
Yeah, that's and then again, we may have talked about this earlier, but no matter, this is obviously compounded by the pandemic because now
Mm,
we've got these pervasive reminders of death everywhere, and a large chunk of the people in our country, for example, they worked in the service industry in jobs that are unlikely to ever return. So, on top of the economic insecurity produced by the pandemic, is the fact that a significant chunk of Americans, they don't even have a vocational or social identity anymore. Their jobs no longer exist. And so I don't think it should surprise us that
mhm.
by every standard, suicide rates, drug and alcohol abuse, domestic violence, PTSD like symptoms, I don't think it's an overstatement to propose that a lot of our fellow Americans are in the midst of an existential crisis of meaning and value.
Yeah, and I think this is really important. And what I'm hearing from you is that, because of the environment right now is so unstable, not just economically, but also culturally, it's actually bringing people. And again, I'm a layman here. I'm not claiming to be a psychologist, Sheldon, but I'm just trying to take your work like I'm a student in your class and put it into my world and sort of reflect back with some ideas. And it makes me feel like, you know in your theories about how the self-esteem is a buffer, the self-esteem is going down. So people now, whether they know it or not, are more connected to death, maybe subconsciously and fearful, and it's making them really unstable. Would that be a correct assumption?
Oh, it's uber correct. So, yeah, you don't need to be a psychologist. You're better off, Jeff. I mean this as a compliment. That's exactly what we
Mhm.
find in our studies. When self-esteem is undermined, it makes unconscious thoughts of death come more readily to mind.
Right.
That threatens to frighten us, and that automatically instigates various defensive responses. So you get some people tranquilize themselves with the trivial. They're the ones, spraying Cheese Whiz on a cracker, downing a 30 pack of old Milwaukee, on the way to Walmart to buy a machine gun and a lemon because there's a sale. Other
Right.
people, though, in order to manage their existential anxieties, and the point is that one need not be aware of this. And this is what's very important, because some people listening might say, well, I'm not afraid of death. And therefore, these ideas must be crazy. But
Mhm.
with all due respect, the reason that you're not afraid of death is that these unconscious death thoughts are being converted into other responses that keep you from ever becoming aware of what it is that's
What
on.
are the responses? What is the
Nice. And
response?
so, one response that's quite unfortunate is that when we're reminded that we're going to die, we tend to denigrate, we tend to berate and belittle people who are different. And so, in our studies, when Christians are reminded that they're going to die, they like Christians a lot more and they hate Jewish people.
Right.
Jewish people reminded that they're going to die, they love Jewish people and they hate
Right.
everybody else. But Germans reminded they're going to die sit further away from people who look like immigrants, and they
Mhm.
sit closer to people who look like Germans. And
You know, this
so,
is this is interesting. I just want to interject a little bit. Did you ever see the movie The Planet of the Apes in 1967?
of course,
That's an awesome movie. Anyway, when they were offset and they were having lunch and they were all in costume and they were just sitting at the table in between sets and they were
yep,
having lunch and talking. Well, they were all in like they were orangutans, they were chimpanzees, they were gorillas,
yep,
and whatever outfits you were in at lunchtime, those people had huddled together and they'd sit down at the lunch table. So the actors that were dressed as chimps were sitting together at the lunch table, and the gorillas, and they weren't interacting anymore. And I found that kind of relates to what you're saying. People will team up.
yes, and that's a brilliant point, Jeff, because it turns out that it takes less than 5 minutes to join a tribe.
Wow.
In psychobabble, it's called the minimal group effect. You can bring people into a lab and like have two pictures in the lab of different art styles. So let's say you have like a Picasso, an abstract, and then a Rembrandt, more of a traditional piece of art. And you could just ask people, well, which picture do you like more? And 5 minutes later, people like whoever likes their picture more than whoever likes the other one.
Right.
That's how
Right.
little it takes in order to form groups. And Virginia Woolf, one of my favorite authors, she just said, she said that creatures of illusion that we are, without self-esteem, we're like babes in the cradle. And what better way to get self-esteem but to denigrate somebody who's different? And if you need to, you just make people who are different. She said, we'll hate somebody for the shape of their nose or the color of their shirt.
Right. And is this a quick fix way to subconsciously build self-esteem at a very low level?
Absolutely. Basically, that's lovely. You are basically, in the way that Virginia Woolf put it, she said it's like a magnifying glass. She uses a very lovely metaphor. It's that when you turn a magnifying glass around and look through it, whatever on the other side looks small.
That's
And
what that's what people that are doing things that they're really, really passionate about, or they're doing very well at, either economically or culturally, are probably not going to be as um, tough on other people. Not always, but you have a large group of people right now that are not doing well economically. And sometimes, they're stupid or deplorable. They're just in that space right now for whatever reason.
Yeah.
And you have these large groups of people that are like, you know what, we're all together and F them. Social media is magnifying that. And we have this massive divide and this massive, not only economic, but social inequality that, came on very, very quickly. And it's super pronounced right now, man. I'm sure you see it knowing what you know.
No, that's a good point, Jeff. And it's also not to go academic on you, but there are studies that show that very narcissistic people, they like radical inequality. They want a hierarchical system where they can declare themselves the best by diminishing their regard for others. And so we're not in a good situation in that respect.
Right. What's the point? What's the point of being so rich and famous if everybody else is going to be that rich and famous? It's really,
there you go.
Pretty fucking sad.
That's quite right. But that's the narcissistic way. A person with genuine self-regard is not put off by other people's success. Right. Not only that, and I think this is radically important, and it's Karen Horney, a psychoanalyst yesteryear, she just said, look, this is really of radical importance because we're all sometimes narcissistic and we're all sometimes have genuine self-regard. And so, I grew up in New Jersey, and I remember being in grade school and getting an exam back and doing well. And I would be like so elated till I looked around and saw that my classmates had done well also. And then if somebody did better than me, I would be praying that God would help me out and just hit them with a thunderbolt. And then after that, to drop a mountain on top of their head. In other words, it only mattered if I was the best. And if someone was better than me, that just made me angry and vindictive. But Horney's point is that when you have genuine self-regard, and again, I hope that every one of us could see that we're sometimes both. When you have genuine self-regard, you're delighted by someone else's success. Moreover, when you're in the company of excellence, someone who is just unambiguously better than you, you're inspired by that. And, so we use an example in our book. It's like, oh, yeah, you think you're a great athlete, but if you have a chance to run, let's say you think you're a great runner, and you get to compete against Olympic athletes, but then you're like, oh, my knee hurts, I'm not going to do it. You're just wanting to avoid being directly compared to those who are demonstrably better. On the other hand, let's say I'm an aspiring musician and I get to play with one of the greats, Yo-Yo Ma, Jimi Hendrix, or whatever. Right. Well, I'll never be as good as them, and they'll make a mockery of my skills. But it would still be the best thing that ever happened to me to be in the company of genuine brilliance. So,
well, imagine you could give somebody a roadmap to be able to emotionally get in that space to be that way, and that's really, the trick, because that's based on your own cognitive ability, the roadmap you choose, and the experience that you have or allow yourself to see to get yourself in that position, and that. Really, I want to switch gears for a second, because someone that you talk about is the philosopher Heidegger.
Yep.
Right. And he talks about the lie that we live. And I believe how does that lie that we live, how does that correlate to self-esteem? Because that subject matter with Heidegger really moved me. And maybe you could break it down a hell of a lot better than I can.
Yeah. Well, Heidegger, who I'm just becoming familiar with, makes points. Now, he's way before Becker, and I'm somewhat surprised that Becker doesn't refer to him a bit more, but no matter. Heidegger's point is just pretty much that we're all thrown into the world, the way that he puts it. And long before we even are aware of the fact that we exist, we're already embedded and engaged with the world around us, all of the people, all of the things, and quite unconsciously and quite understandably, we are fallen into a world not of our choosing. And by the time we wake up one day, and I'd be like, oh, I'm Sheldon. I grew up in the Bronx, and then I moved to New Jersey. I'm already a cultural artifact. And
Mhm.
unbeknownst to me, and you alluded to this earlier, most of us just kind of unself-reflectively adopt the patterns of life that are demanded by our culture, and we behave in accordance with the standards that we're introduced to in the service of enhancing self-worth to
Can I,
minimize
could,
existential anxieties.
yeah, yeah. I'm sorry that I'm cutting you off, but I'm seeing some things in between the words that I think are really, really important. And
Go.
you talk about just being reflective in a way that's sort of robotic for people before they go out and they actually have the ability and the confidence to make their own choices. And I think this relates to Heidegger, because he talks about how do they discover this process. I mean, they sort of just like wipe everything off and they start again, and they kind of sometimes do this subconsciously, and
Yeah.
and it rebuilds themselves back up into something or a person emotionally to rebuild your self-esteem and your confidence, to be able to look at these people that you're talking about and honor instead of denigrate,
Yeah. No,
I
no,
mean,
that's
how do you, like how you become that person. And I think people have these pivotal points in their lives, or pivots, where they completely change their lives and they rebuild themselves back up to become this type of person, and they don't even know that they're doing it.
yes.
Does that make sense?
No, you're Heidegger Jr. That's awesome. You said pivot, and that's a great word. Heidegger calls it turning. And he says that the psychological catalyst of this process is anxiety, or in German, Angst. And again,
Mhm.
what makes this complicated, Jeff, is that you don't need to know that any of this is happening. Heidegger just says that every one of us from time to time experiences, anxiety. I like Angst as a word because in German, that
Mhm.
word means anxiety, but it also means that you're just feeling unsettled and not particularly at home, where home is not a place, but so much just where you're just not feeling comfortably situated in the world around you. And
Right.
Heidegger's point is that what underlies that anxiety, like it or not, is the awareness of death, and that what happens thereafter depends on your reaction to that anxiety.
But
And
that's really important. I know I'm cutting off, but
no, cut off.
if I don't say this to you and what you're saying, like I'm going to miss it, and some of the people are going to be missing it. And you're saying you're feeling uncomfortable in the world. You don't know why. Something's calling to you, and I'd say most people don't make that shift or do something to change. I gotta just fucking leave the state, or I got to leave my job right now. Something has to change because I feel so super uncomfortable. And that happened to me in my 20s. And I know it happens to a lot of people. But the only way that you're going to come up and be able to look at yourself and look at people in the way, like honoring people, to be able to have that mindset and not looking like screw them, their nose is big, whatever it may be, you gotta shift, and you gotta tear yourself down, and you gotta come back in a way that you can look at people from arm's length.
Awesome. So let's keep going because it was brilliant, Jeff. You just said calling. And that's a Heidegger word. He's like, look, when most people, when we hear the word anxiety, we're like, wow, that's bad. And we want to flee from anxiety. And
Right.
Heidegger says that's what most of us do.
Mm-hmm.
He calls it a flight from death.
Mm-hmm.
And he's like, yeah, for a lot of us, that anxiety drives us back to our culture. And we become even more of a meat puppet than we already were.
Right.
And so Carlos Castaneda, back in the day, the Don Juan dude, he said the
Yeah, yeah,
average
yeah, yeah.
person seeks approval in the eyes of others and calls that self-confidence, whereas the warrior seeks approval in their own eyes and calls it humility. All right, back to Heidegger, though. So Heidegger says, look, I get it. Anxiety repels us. But he also says, he uses the same word that you did, Jeff. He said anxiety is a calling, that it is ourselves summoning ourselves to ourselves, saying that you're not yourself. All right.
Right, 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 right,
And
right.
Heidegger's like, oh, well, what does that mean? Well, what that means, and I like his language, again, remembering that it's allegorical. You don't need to know that this is happening. But he's like, well, when anxiety is a calling, that opens up a mental horizon. And you are able to step back and metaphorically realize that you are embedded in this culturally constructed fiction
Right.
that it has made you something and someone that is not necessarily who you are. The existentialists call it inauthentic. Um,
Right.
and Heidegger says, okay, so basically, you don't even know who you are yet. You don't even know, in Heidegger's language, your own self. And you already said what has to happen, Jeff. He's like, you have this, he called it a moment of vision, where you recognize that you're not a cultural construction. You're able to realize that all of us are essentially, just relatively inconsequential specks of respiring carbon-based protoplasm. Born in a time and place not of our choosing, here for an infinitely small amount of time, after which we get redeposited into the cosmos. And Heidegger's point is that you can be utterly demoralized by that realization, but it could also be the most uplifting recognition in
It
one's
is.
entire life.
It is, but you need to go down like to the basement to come back up to the second floor. You got
There
to go
you
down.
go.
I mean, you got to go down and you got to experience some things that are really, really tough. I don't want to bring myself so personally into it, but I want to break it down simply like the construct you're talking about. You're like, you know what? If I'm not driving a BMW and I don't have $1 million in my bank account and a beautiful girl in my arm, I'm a loser. But how do you break yourself down to a point where you're not affected by that construct and you're saying, you know what, I'm okay in the VW and my girl's great. She just loves me and she thinks I'm great for who I am. And that's enough. And I like Sheldon, even though he's so much more brilliant than me. I just love listening to him because I'm learning shit from him. I don't need to feel, devalued because of that.
Yeah. Well, that's literally the hope. So the Heidegger point is that you can sandblast away the aspects of your identity that are culturally determined. In principle, then, two things have to happen. One is that you really do have to accept the reality of the human condition. You have to be able to say, I'm not going to be here forever. And Heidegger's adamant about this. He's like, no, it's not good enough to say, I know I'm going to die at some vaguely unspecified future moment.
Right.
Because if you're doing that, you're just denying death by trying to stick some hours and days and years in between reality and your ultimate fate. Because reality is, I could get smote by a comet in 5 seconds or have a stroke or get the coronavirus later today. You have to realize that your death is always immediately impending. And then on top of that, you have to deal with what the existentialists call existential guilt. And that's a tough word because when we hear guilt, we think you did something wrong, that it's a moral transgression. But when the existentialists talk about guilt, they just mean that you're responsible for the decisions that you make or decline to make, despite the fact that your decisions are clearly limited by factors that are beyond your control. right? You and I may want to give birth to children, but that's not happening. We lack the internal biological equipment. And I'm a professor and you're a successful business person. Yeah, but what if we were born in the 3rd century in Mongolia? We might be goat herders or even goats. And the Heidegger point is that you have to realize that whatever your circumstances, you still have the freedom to choose. You are responsible for choosing. And I like this Henry Miller dude of yesteryear when he said, we are all guilty of crime, the great crime of not living life to the fullest.
And I guess really the difficult part for most people, and include everyone, is making that choice to be able to pivot, to be able to look down that new road.
Yeah.
To be able to figure out. I mean, you don't even know what's happening to you when it's happening to you, but how can I look at it in a much different way that's going to bring me a lot more ease, and not looking at everybody else that's saying that they're the enemy.
Yes. No, brilliant, Jeff. This is awesome. And I love your words. And it's better that you're not a psychologist. You just said, what's going to bring me ease? And to me, that's the key, because when I blubber in my classes, I'm like, well, when things are not going well, we're in a state of dis-ease. Throw a hyphen between dis and ease. And again, the Heidegger point, which I'm very captivated by, he's like, okay, well, how do you know if you've made what you called a pivot? And he calls it a turning. And just like the Buddhists, he's like, a Buddhist said enlightenment is quite ordinary. It's not like God tosses, a beam of light in your face and you know that you've been radically transformed. Because Heidegger's point is, when you come back into life metaphorically, things are not much different except that they are. And
the other thing is, again, you say these words that really they really hit home with me. And when people are listening to this, the turning is, and correct me if I'm wrong, the turning is, how do I believe enough in my feelings and my own heart to follow things through, and not be so affected by the outside environment, to bring me into a calmer state, which helps with building the self-esteem, which eventually pushes away the anxiety, and the death and the death denial.
Yes, exactly and precisely. And so Heidegger's like, well, how do I know I'm getting there? And I like the words that he uses. He says, okay, he uses a phrase, anticipatory resoluteness. All right, well, anticipatory, we all know what that word means. It means to look forward. And again, maybe this is common sense masquerading as psychological insight, but when things are going well, we are looking forward. And then to be resolute, I grew up in New Jersey, so I had to look that word up, but it means to be incredibly determined. It's like all ahead full, let's do stuff. All right, but then Heidegger adds that when we're in this condition, we're not just isolated nomads concerned about ourselves. He says we will also have solicitous regard. I had to look up that word too. That just means that you give a shit about the people and the things around you. And then he goes on to say that in this condition, life appears to us subjectively as an ongoing adventure that is filled with unshakable joy. And I love that. And like, Heidegger's not an idiot. And this is not to suggest that life from then on will be like a Mary Poppins Walt Disney movie. This in no way obliterates the fact that suffering is still part of life. Pain is still part of life. But that's the reality of the human condition. And in order to fully partake of the joys of living,
Mm.
That will never negate the downside, but it will certainly take the edge off it. And
Right.
again, as a former meat puppet who grew up in New Jersey, thinking that I had to be the best at everything,
Hmm.
and it's taken decades, and I don't know if I'm even there yet, Jeff, but I'm almost there. I can honestly say to you that I love it when I get to do something that makes me look smart and famous, and people say, "Look at this potato head. He wrote a book." I'm human. We like being stroked by the world.
Right.
I like it just as much, truth be told, when I wake up in the morning and get a face full of fresh air and walk my dog around the block. And to me, without, being overly polemic about this, that's just a fancy word for pushing this point too much. But yeah, I think when you're getting there. Oh, when, as the dead philosopher Nietzsche put it, when
Hmm.
you're in a position to make judgments about values based on what is meaningful and valuable to you.
Right, right. Well, I mean, I think what's really interesting in what you said is, you like those accolades sometimes, and it's joyful for you. But how can you be in a place like that where you're not being an ass back to people? You get that feeling back to you, and the other thing is, it's like, how do you get down to that joyful exploratory road that some people feel sometimes? It can't happen all the time,
That's
but
correct.
it's really about and if anybody's going to take any away, it's like, if you have a calling, we talked about, and you feel an unease, you'd like things to get a little bit easy. It's finding out what that pivot is, and that pivot may be a dark road before you see some light, really dark.
Yeah. And that's, again, it's a fine point. Back to the Karen Horney woman. Well,
Mm,
she pointed out in the 1940s, she's like, look, if you have, gone to therapy or even analyzed yourself, and you're like, wow, I'm less of an asshole than I was back in the day. And you know what? It was pretty easy and it wasn't very painful. Horney's reaction would be, with all due respect, you're still probably an asshole of cosmic proportions, because there's no such thing as anything constructive happening on the personality front that doesn't involve a momentary detour through one of Dante's circles of psychological hell.
right.
Because by definition, and you said this brilliantly earlier today, Jeff, it's that when our culturally constructed beliefs are obliterated and we no longer have a way to make ourselves feel good about ourselves because our self-esteem is waning, that brings thoughts of death momentarily to mind. And there's a point in this process where psychologically you don't know who you are. So here's Heidegger saying you have to blast away the part of your identity
Right,
that
right,
was culturally infused. Well, there's that kind of psychological purgatory where
right.
you've abandoned an aspect of your identity, but have not yet resurrected yourself in your own image, as it were.
Right. So basically, if you want to get down the yellow brick road, you got to blast your identity. And that's what people really need to understand, because we grow up a certain way and our
Yeah.
identities derive from that. And if you're not feeling good and you're not feeling at ease, you're going to have to figure out a way, whether if you can put to the words to it or not, is how to blast your identity and come out on the other side. Man, this would be an amazing, just this subject matter alone would be an amazing class for young people. Just something built around this
Yeah.
would be amazing.
No, awesome, Jeff. And I think that moving forward, to put these ideas into play,
Mm,
I think a few things. One is that these kinds of ventures are more important than anything that we could do academically. We can do our experiments and we could write our books and 12 people could read our studies. But these are ideas that I think are important for everyone. Imperative, therefore, is to have these kinds of conversations that are hopefully accessible to larger clumps of humanity. And then the next step is to make these ideas accessible to kids in the context of being educated. I've had the good fortune of being asked to talk about these ideas to grade school children as well as, and moving forward. And you don't come in with an existential sledgehammer and start by telling people that they're going to die and they can get hit by a comet. But we can start by having candid conversations about the importance of self-esteem and the need to derive it from a variety of sources in ways that are accessible to everybody and doesn't involve denigrating others for you to feel good about yourself. And my sense is that it's easier to present these ideas to junior high school students than it is to adults and people with PhDs, because the initial reaction of a lot of adults is to be very threatened by these notions, myself included, because basically I remember reading Becker, in my 20s saying, God damn it, if this guy's right, then I'm a culturally constructed meat puppet too. I took a year off at Skidmore, and worked in restaurants and construction sites because I really felt that I needed to go through. I didn't know it at the time, but I needed my Heidegger effort, my moment of vision to be able to pivot as
you want to know what? You wouldn't have become who you are today if you didn't take a step out and go work in those construction sites.
Absolutely.
Step off, get off the beaten path. The construction that you were talking about that, our culture weighs down on us. And you go and, the people that you probably met at that construction site and never knew before, had the experience of being with, whether they're simple, not, whether their ethnicity is their background, you probably learned some things and gained some things in there that allowed you to pivot and head towards that ease. Some of those, those moments. I mean, it was for me.
Yeah, no doubt about it, Jeff. They were landmark moments. I still remember all of the folks that I worked with. I remembered how humbling it was to be, for example, working on construction sites. I had a PhD. Most of the guys that I was working with didn't even graduate from high school. And the fact of the matter is that I learned very quickly that, excellence and integrity is almost never a function of education. And here I was with these guys who, rarely transcended the monosyllabic utterance. But when we had to put a tile floor in a department store, and these guys would stand in the middle of this giant floor, and then they would say, okay, we're going to start right here. And they would tell me where to move the piles of tiles. Same thing if we were doing a roof. And sure enough, in 5 minutes, they knew how many tiles we would need, where we would need to start. And I'm like, wait a minute, this is brilliant. And we got done putting a roof on senior citizen apartments this is 30 years ago. And I still drive by and I'm like, there's folks who live in this town. I put that roof on that house. A PhD was particularly worthless with regard to the skills necessary to do that. And it just really radically broadened my appreciation of people. And I learned that I learned to not fall into the trap of using the standard ways that we fall into to judge people. Because you probably know this as well as I. You're like, yeah, everybody's equal, blah, blah, blah. but still you're like, yeah, but wait a minute, I'm more equal. I've got more degrees, and I'm a teacher, not a carpenter or a dishwasher. And yet, what I found in my year off is, again, excellence and integrity are everywhere. If we could ever get to a place where that's the basis upon which we judge each other, well, then in principle, everybody could garner a modicum of self-worth by merely, and I'm saying merely as if this is easy, but the fact is that if the standards by which we acquire self-esteem are just based on genuine effectiveness in the context of whatever it is that we do day to day, yeah, a lot more people would not be psychologically debilitated.
Yeah, and we need this self-esteem that you're talking about in our culture to be able to emotionally rationalize with the fear and the inevitability
That's right.
of death. And, the PhD pivoting and going to the construction site, whether you knew it or not, or me leaving my job in my 20s and then bartending for a year before I went and started my other business. I mean, going from a 6-figure job I went to, I'm like, I'm out of here. I just can't do this anymore. And I didn't want to bring so much of my person into this, but I wanted to share with your construction job story because it really, I mean, you're a PhD and you're like, I'm going to go do construction because you just needed to get off that path for a second and look from the outside in. And when I went and was bartending, I met people, I mean, all ethnicities, working with gay people, just wonderful people that I had never crossed paths with before. And that pivot completely changed my perspective and allowed me to look at people and judge people. And as you said, walk down a road with a little bit more color than I ever did before. And if you don't get off the train for a while and walk around a new town and do that, well, you're going to look at things in a negative way for most of your life.
Yeah. Again, great advice and true at a very foundational level. I'm going to use your language. It's that, yeah, we all got to get off the train, even if it's just for a few stops. Otherwise, we can never differentiate between the world that has been presented to us and is depicted by our culture and the world as it might actually be in light of our impressions of it once we see things outside of the train car, as you put it. That's really...
Yeah. I wanted to, that was just an awesome segment. I mean, even though this is an interview, just having this conversation with you would really, really uplifting, really, really providing me with just, a great feeling talking to you about this stuff. I just want to let you know that. Moving along, some of the other things that we talked about that you were interested in talking about, you say money and stuff, and he who dies of the most toys wins. And I think we've hit upon that a lot, but this constant pursuit of huge money is a death denial variable. Wouldn't you say so?
Yeah, absolutely. And more importantly, the Ernest Becker dude, in his book, Escape from Evil, he has a chapter called Money, the New Immortality Ideology. Right. And he just says, look, people don't, for the most part, belief in God is less than it used to be. And yet money has become God for most people. And if you don't believe that, look on the back of a dollar bill where it says, "In God we trust," and then go to the left of that, and you'll see a little pyramid with a floating eyeball on top, and that's an ancient Egyptian symbol of immortality. And so, Becker says that what drives our insatiable desire for money and stuff is death anxiety. So old timers might remember a play, Tennessee Williams' Cat on a Hot Tin Roof. Have you ever heard of that one, Jeff?
Sure.
Yeah, yes. So Big Daddy in that play, he says the human animal is a beast that dies. And if he's got money, he buys and he buys and he buys. And I think that one of the reasons that he buys and buys is that in the back of his mind, he has the crazy hope that one of his purchases will be life everlasting. And again, none of us need to be aware of this, but studies have shown that when we're reminded that we're going to die, we say we need more money to feel like we're wealthy. We're more interested in buying fancy stuff like a Lexus and a Rolex.
Right.
If we're asked to draw pictures of money, we draw bigger pictures. And the study that I find most amazing was done by some Polish colleagues. They just had people count money. They didn't get to keep it. They just had it in their hands. And then they measured death anxiety. And just having money in your hand reduced death anxiety. So yeah, basically our argument is that what drives the economic machine, that is the underpinnings of capitalism, is the insatiable desire for money and stuff driven by death anxiety.
So it's a subconscious deflection, and it's going to make you feel better.
Yeah,
And
there it is.
Yeah, right. So what were you saying? If I just get that last dollar, that last purchase, I'm going to feel, what did you say?
I'm gonna feel secure. I'm gonna feel like I'm on top of the earth.
Right. So you're watching, people are watching social media and TV, and all of a sudden this guy's worth 90 billion today, and this guy's worth 105 billion. You know what, man? If I could just get there, which is also almost impossible, I'd reach that nirvana. So my self-esteem's in the shit, and so every time something gets tough in society, specifically, this COVID, I just don't have the coat or the ability to deflect that. My anxiety about death just increases.
Yes,
maybe. I mean, I may be wrong about that.
You're frankly not wrong. And this gets back to being in the psychological ringer when you're adhering to standards that are just not attainable. Because basically the Beckers of the world, they're just saying, look, beware of insatiable desires. That any natural desire has an upper limit. I love pizza, but after 8 slices, I'm like, no mas, I've had enough.
Right.
I love chocolate, but after a 55-gallon drum of M&Ms, I'm like, I've got enough. Give me a shot of insulin. And my silly point to the college students is, tell me what you like most. And they'll be like, oh, pizza, beer, sex. I'm like, fill in the blank. Anything natural, enough is enough. And Mary Poppins said that, enough is as good as a feast. Well, what's the one thing that's never enough? Well, it's money and stuff. You ask a billionaire, what are you going to do tomorrow? And they're like, I'm going to make more money. And the point is that unbeknownst to ourselves, humankind, we're like hamsters on the exercise wheel. And we are keeping this economic machine going in order to satisfy our death, in order to reduce our death anxiety. And Max,
and you know what? Yeah,
I
just want to say one thing. Just look. If people are listening, it's not about downgrading money. Money is something you need. It could be a good thing.
We're just
talking about, you don't need that billionaire hit to reach that level, which is just going to make you feel completely inadequate as you try and analyze that.
Yes, absolutely. And an important point. This is not dissing money. What this is to proclaim that we need to separate the value of money as a means of exchanging goods and services. We need to feel good about what we earn, and we also need to feel fine about being consumers. But that's a far cry from I'm only going to be happy if I have more than you. And if the iPhone people put out another model tomorrow, then I've got to toss what I have now in the toilet and get the new one.
Well, it's pretty easy. It's pretty easy to see why, based off what you're saying and this back and forth here, why people are really having a hard time. And it's obvious you and I have experience too. We're not impenetrable to it, but we're able to put some words to it, some levity to it, and an equation to it. And I think that's what's really important, about this conversation right now. And I hope people really get it, because it's so freaking prevalent what's going on right now, especially with the past election and what happened. Just it's amazing conversation. You also talked about death denial in the wake of the what do you call it, incoming climate and the change in climate.
Yeah, not to be somber, but the fact of the matter is that we know that the pandemic, has been a pervasive reminder of death, and we know that all of the unfortunate aspects of being human are magnified under those conditions. And so here we
Right.
are surrounded by the pandemic. Hate crimes are up against people of color and Asian people. The consumption of money and stuff is up. People are shopping more. People are drinking more, and so that's not a good thing. And yet, the pandemic is going to be like a minor case of indigestion compared to the environmental apocalypse that is about to befall us. And, I wish I didn't have to say this with such strident confidence, but, 50 years ago, Jimmy Carter said it's time to get off fossil fuels. And if we don't, the world's going to suck. And we did nothing. And 50 years ago, I could teach and say, you know what, your grandchildren are going to be fucked, if you'll pardon the expression.
Cool.
Well, 20 years ago, I could say to students, you know what, I'll be dead, but your world's going to be a lot different. Well, if I don't stroke out, the world's going to be a lot different by 2030, let's say.
Right.
And this will have so many unfortunate implications, including the possibility that because of the death anxiety that's aroused by climate change, we will react by becoming more militantly devoted to the very same politics and economics that have magnified the problem and that is rendering it impossible to deal with. So what I mean by that, Jeff, is that, here we are, the climate's going to get worse. And what are a lot of people going to do? Well, they're going to want to buy more money and stuff. They're going to become more racist and more xenophobic. They're going to become more psychologically disassociated. And they're going to become more attracted to charismatic political leaders. Like I referred to former President Trump as Orange Hitler. But he's not the only Nazi on the planet. It is very common in times of distress that we embrace certain kinds of leaders who arrogantly proclaim that they're divinely infused to rid the world of evil. And of course, the problem with such leaders is that they are rarely capable and almost always best defined as incompetent and corrupt. And so, moreover, those kinds of political leaders, they're polarizing. They're like, oh, America first, you do what you're doing and we'll do what we're doing. But the problem is that environmental problems of that scale cannot be tackled individually. If we're to survive, it will be by recognizing that we as human beings are in this together. And the overriding prerequisite I would submit to any effective approach to climate change is going to be the realization that when the psychological dust settles, we're all humans. We have more in common than we are different. And if we're unable to shed our tribal identities long enough to collaborate and cooperate in the service of making the world habitable for humans, or at least for things that are alive, we're going to have tough times ahead.
Yeah, and based off what you just said, it's really easy for me to see that why we're so divided, why we're becoming so tribal. It's a subconscious reaction to a really intense environment and stressful environment. And then people that are at the helm of media or certain leaders that are, they're purposely and consciously keeping it divided. So people fight.
No, that's exactly right. And probably a a discussion for another time. But Hannah Arendt, who's a philosopher, wrote a book about the origins of totalitarianism in the aftermath of World War II. So she's trying to figure out, how do you get like a Hitler or a Mussolini? And what she points out is that the hallmark of fascism is to create a polarized difference of us versus them. And my point is that amongst his many failings, and people I'm sure will feel free to disagree, I believe that President Trump is one of the worst presidents ever, and certainly a caricature of a stereotype of every unfortunate human attribute. But the point that I would make is that his biggest failing was that he never started to govern as the president of the United States. He declared that he was running for re-election the morning of his inauguration. And his inauguration speech, he doubled down on Hitler when he just continued to define Americans in terms of whether or not they supported him. Every other American president, you have a hotly contested election, and then you say the election's over. We're all Americans. And when we do that, that brings out the very best in our pro-social tendencies. What he did instead was to say there's two kinds of Americans. There's the ones who support me. They're real Americans. Right. And then there's the negrotinous liberal hordes of people who don't support me, and they're not Americans. In fact, they're not even human in his mind.
Right. And when you break people off into these groups like this and it becomes so emotionally stressful, like we were talking earlier, you're going to start thinking about your survival. You're going to get scared. You're going to start thinking about death, and you're going to start saying that guy over there is my enemy. I should be afraid of him, and I should knock him. I should knock his nose off right now. And that's what's going on in the country. That doesn't have to be going on. Naturally, there's some of these stressful things going on in the environment with climate change. We don't need that culturally going on with people that are telling us or trying to, guide us in our culture.
That's correct.
It's I don't want to talk about Trump, and I don't want to get political. I appreciate your opinions on him. I'll say this: I wouldn't want to meet the guy.
Yeah, and my point that's correct. I don't want to get overly political.
No, it's fine.
I'll risk being annoying by pointing out that we're not out of danger yet. Anyone who thinks the election is over. We came very close to essentially a fascist takeover of the American government. We're still in the middle of efforts to undermine democracy. So what Hannah Arendt said is the way fascists work is you win an election with a minority of the vote, and then you use the power of democracy to end democracy. And so what President Trump did, and you do that by undermining the press, by weakening the judiciary, and by replacing competent civil servants with corrupt and incompetent stooges, which is exactly what has happened. And so even in the aftermath of the election, there is still not an acknowledgement that the election was legitimately won by now President Biden. And there's now efforts to make it such that people, particularly people of color and people in impoverished communities, don't get to vote again. And so my point, we can talk politics another time, is that we're still in a tenuous moment. And I live in a Republican town, so my neighbors are generally Trump supporters. They're decent humans. They're smart folks. And the only thing that I would ask him to think about is the irony, which is that, and it was Howard Stern who made this point, and that is that, Trump is disgusted by the people who support him, and he loathes them and has done nothing to help them except to make them feel proud to be white. And that's so my biggest concern. Above and beyond all of the turmoil that has arisen in the last 4 or 5 years, is we've got a large chunk of America that is systematically deluded by the world's greatest liar, who is not really acting in ways that address their interests. So that would be my view of that.
Yeah, I mean, look, I couldn't say it any better, but I think coming from you, and me just looking at it neutrally for the people that might be listening in, it's a real problem. I hope it gets better. I don't know if it will. What do you
Yeah.
think?
Well, again, one more thing, and that's I go Abe Lincoln when I'm talking to people who I may disagree with, because Lincoln, he was like, you know what? Don't be talking shit like saying, oh, it's about freedom or liberty. He called them pernicious abstractions that are ultimately to get our attention away from the actual issues. And
Right.
so my point when I'm talking to my neighbors and my friends is that, well, let's talk about the things that we agree about.
Right.
Over 70% of the people in the United States are in favor of what the Biden administration has done with regard to the virus and the relief monies. And so why don't we start by agreeing that that was a good thing?
Or at least, not hate them or denigrate them because they have a different opinion. And really the way to get that is going back to our Heidegger comment, is how do you pivot and rebuild yourself into a construct that's not going to look at everyone like they're an enemy. And
No,
that's the
there
way
you go.
I
Yeah,
mean,
but in order to do that, we've got some radical work to do, because we in America have been lobotomized to the point where we no longer understand what a fact is. And we also are grotesquely ignorant of the way democracy works in our
mm,
country. So, anyone who says, oh, we're entitled to our opinion, so I have my opinion as a Trump supporter, and you have your opinion as a Biden supporter, well, that would be fine, except 80% of what Trump says is factually incorrect. And whereas the average political candidate, about 20% of what they say, politicians lie. But my point is that you can't get started until we can admit that 2 and 2 is 4,
right.
and everything else that comes from that. We have a radical asymmetry right now, where on one side of the political spectrum is a denial of fact and contempt for scientific inquiry. And then the other thing that we need desperately, Jeff, is to, back in my day, we learned what democracy was in civics classes in ways that weren't politically charged. So most Americans can't name the 3 branches of government or explain the relationship between them. Most Americans don't understand, for example, that state governments can't print money. And therefore, in pandemics like this, the only place to get resources is from the federal government.
Right.
Most people don't understand the way that the Senate works, and why it was that Mitch McConnell, when he was in the majority for the last few years, kept hundreds of bills from even coming to a vote. Right? Most Americans support immigration reform. But for the last 10 years, whenever a Republican has the majority in the Senate, they don't allow those bills to be voted on, because they know if they were, they would pass, because most Americans want them. So anyway, I think democracy needs some help, but the best way to make that happen is for us as citizens to become better informed participants in the democratic process.
Yeah, and I think also just to maybe go through some of these personal evolutions to be able to get to it, to be able to look at it in the way that we're talking about it, or the way that you're talking, all right? And
No, absolutely.
you got to go down around that exploratory road to be able to listen to a guy like you and totally get it. Not everybody's going to get it. I mean, let me tell you, talking to you today, I'm really honored by it. And I've been studying your work now since we started talking about a month ago, and it's really changed it's changed my life. It's changed my life, and it's helped validate a lot of feelings and opinions that I had that didn't necessarily have a direction. And that's part of going down that exploratory road to rebuild yourself. I had a couple more questions, and this is related to some of the passions that you had in your own studies, and that was the role of death and anxiety in various psychological disorders. And there's a lot of psychological disorder we were talking about in the political scheme of things, but just in people's personal lives. How do you see that?
Yeah. So following the Ernest Becker dude and another guy, Erwin Yalom, who wrote a book called Existential Psychotherapy, those folks argue that anxiety about death contributes to all kinds of psychological disorders. Now, this is not to say that it causes them, but it at the very least magnifies them. Right. And there's now a large body of research that a lot of it done by us and some by other folks that just show that, for example, when you remind spider phobics that these are people afraid of spiders, that they're going to die, well, they become more afraid of spiders. When people that have OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, when we remind them of death, they use more soap and water to wash their hands. Socially anxious people, when we remind them of death, they hide in a closet longer. Right. And so the point is that there's a big body of literature connecting death anxiety to various psychological disorders. And what that suggests is that the same kind of pivoting that we were alluding to earlier that might help the, quote, average individual thrive may similarly be useful in therapeutic settings to help folks with different disorders have a better time of it. Now, this is, again, not to say that the key to all therapeutic interactions is to be direct and confront death anxiety head on. What a lot of the existential psychotherapists point out is that you can be in therapy for a year or multiple years, and the word death might never come up, but it doesn't mean that that's not what you're doing as you help people navigate through their own world. Because therapy is essentially, again, I like how Karen Horney puts it, Jeff. She's like, all right, therapy's like climbing a mountain. Now, you may be able to get up there on your own, but think of a therapist as a guide. The therapist isn't going to carry you up the mountain, but having been there before, may have a better sense of which paths are apt to help you be successful.
So you're saying the fear of death and the anxiety and the denial is amplifying a lot of these disorders.
Yes, that's correct.
And do doctors, psychologists, people that are trying to help people with disorders, do you think bridging a communication gap in between those disorders and the denial of death, the anxiety, would be, building a bridge of communication, either emotionally or within someone's mind, would help relieve some of those disorders?
Well, that would be the existential argument. Now, other folks might disagree. So basically, the gold standard these days in therapy is cognitive behavioral therapy. Right. And what those folks say is, you know what, let's not get psychodynamically fancy or even worry about what's happening in your unconscious. Let's just examine beliefs that you now possess that are problematic or dysfunctional, and try to help you change those beliefs. Mm-hmm. My point, with all due respect to the folks who do that work, is that the beliefs that are most dauntingly difficult are ones that pertain to existential questions about meaning and value. And that the minute you start to explore them, you're going to be in death denial territory, whether you're aware of that or not.
Right. I want to go backwards, and it may not be the best thing to do, but I want to talk about climate for a second, and we'll go forward again. I just really remembered something in the discussion that I think is important regarding climate, either whether you believe it or you're a climate denier. Would someone that is in more of death denial not be a person who believes in climate change?
Yeah, good question. That depends on your beliefs to begin with. So we did a study at Skidmore a year or two ago, and we just looked at folks who either voted for former President Trump or who voted for Hillary Clinton in the last election, and reminding Trump supporters about their mortality made them believe less in climate change. But we didn't find that for the Clinton supporters. So here's basically where you're doubling down on your cultural worldviews in response to death reminders. So remember that Trump's whole view is that the virus is not a problem. It will just go away. It's not a big deal. Only wimps wear masks or stand 6 feet away from other people. So those folks, reminded of their mortality, just became more ardently dismissive of the virus in efforts to curtail it. And the reason why that's a problem now, and you're seeing this happen as I speak, is that here we are in a race against time where we've got effective vaccines, but we need about 90% of the American population to be vaccinated to acquire herd immunity. We've got all of these virulent variants that are now spreading around. And what's happening in Republican states is a relaxation of public health mandates, and people like Rand Paul, who's a monstrous senator from Kentucky, just saying, oh, masks, that's just theater. And so that creates a set of circumstances where as more people die and death anxiety becomes more pervasive, I would expect supporters of President Trump to wear masks less, to stand closer to each other, and to not get vaccinated. About 50% of males who voted for Trump say they're not going to get vaccinated. So
you're saying as their anxiety for death goes up,
yeah,
they're
that's correct.
Yeah, and you can apply that as well. Like I had a good friend of mine says, why are all these why is the racism so prevalent in the country? And the question about the climate and the anxiety towards death. I mean, if you're frightened, you're gonna huddle together. Is that what we're saying? We're saying that in basic terms. So a lot of people might say to me, like, why are people racist? And I'm not here to judge why people are racist. I want to look at it. I'm looking at it technically what I'm learning from you. And I'm saying, shit, you know what? If I'm in a room with 3 white guys and a black guy walks in and I'm scared shitless today about whatever, whether it's the climate, maybe it's about wearing masks or not, or the disease, I'm going to go jump over those guys over there, and I'm just going to put my hand up to that guy over there. There you go. And that's something I think, really important if people are listening. I think it's a very simple breakdown of it that could really help understand a very complex and dangerous, construct.
Yeah. Let me give you one more thought along those lines, Jeff, because again, profound and important. There are studies that show that white people who are briefly shown pictures of black faces are thereafter more likely to say that an ambiguous object is a gun. So think about that, how often black dudes are killed when they're carrying like cell phones and rulers.
Right.
Did what I say just make sense? So basically,
no, I mean it's sinking in. The reason why I'm not reacting is I'm just it's profound.
Yeah, and then again, this may sound politically contentious, but everything is political. And when you say that you're not political, you're being political. We have to understand that the American worldview is fundamentally racist and always has been. So we have to remember that the construct of race was created in order to justify slavery. So because here we were at the beginning of America, the land of the free, the home of the brave, everyone's created equal. Oh, but we have slaves. Well, what we did to avoid the remarkable cognitive dissonance was to declare people of color to be unintelligent, not quite human. And we've never gotten away from that. That's why, basically, Bob Dylan in one of his songs in the 60s, he says, you're better than him. You've been born with white skin, he explained. Or Lyndon Johnson, when he was signing the Civil Rights Act and saying that a Democrat will never win an election in the South again, he's like, look, for poor white people, you got to have the black people to give them something to look down on. Right. And in so doing, for the poor white people not to notice that their interests are more aligned with the black people that they despise than they are with the people telling them who to hate. And Johnson just said, if you give a white person someone to look down on, they'll actually empty their pockets for you. And that's precisely what we're now seeing. And I don't think things are going to change that much until all of us that are white are able to recognize the structural inequalities that still pervade American society.
But that's such a, that's not, and these are not, easy concepts for, the general Joe walking down the street. I'm not saying it's hard enough but to get in touch with, to be able to ensconce yourself in those ideas, that you're talking about. I mean, it takes time, and it takes a will and effort to educate yourself and to believe in yourself, to look at it. I mean, and that's really a question of how do you get more people to look at it. I mean, super fascinating, Sheldon. I wanted to just pare it back a little bit and ask you one question I'm going to make it the last question that is really near and dear to me, and wanted your opinion on it. And I think really lends to our discussion and can be really helpful for me. And people maybe they're listening, I walk away. I have a 4-year-old little boy and a late bloomer dad. What would you do with your son from 4 years old onward to help him or prepare for some of the things that you and I have been discussing that could help him be a more well-adjusted, less anxiety ridden? I mean, obviously everybody they're wired a certain way, and the certain anxieties will be more amplified or not, depending upon how your mind is built. But what would you recommend someone like me or anybody out there that has a young child to prepare them for what we've been discussing a little bit? I mean, it's a hard question, I know.
Yeah, it is a hard question.
I'm sorry to put you on the spot.
Yeah. All right. So my quick answer, and then maybe we pick this up another time, is that you be the father that I suspect you already are, in light of the pivot that you have made in your life. Right. And so, again, not to, there are some parents who have 4-year-old kids. Does your child go to private school?
You're asking me that?
Yeah.
Yeah, he goes to a private, like a Montessori.
Yeah. All right. Does he take music lessons yet?
He really likes music. He sings music. We play music in the house. I play guitar.
But now I'm asking you, does he take music? Does he play?
We've had him in a class before, but he does not take regular music lessons.
Yeah,
in school they play with things.
Yeah, but again, if you were a real parent from Long Island, it wouldn't matter what your kid likes. It'd be like, you're going to private school, you're taking fucking music lessons, you're going to play on the soccer team. If you don't have a startup company by the time you're 5, you're a failure. We got to get going on your after school tutoring so that you still have a chance to get into Yale. And again, you're still in diapers. And my opinion is that people who have made the so-called pivot might be more interested in getting to know what their children are interested in and might like, rather than trying to wedge them into a high dollar, high prestige social position. How about going the other way and just trying to encourage our offspring to develop their own talents and interests independent of cultural expectations. A tall order, but one to strive towards.
No, it's amazing what you say. And I also listened to another psychologist about it, and he told me, he said, don't leave your son on the floor. Get on the floor with him, and if he wants to play with trucks with him.
Oh, I love that.
And if he wants to swim, then go swim, because that's really, I think a lot of adults, don't think that they need to speak that language. And I think what you're lending to is you're trying to figure out, even though your son or your daughter can't communicate, you're saying, you like trucks? All right, let's go dissect trucks together.
I love it.
And so that's actually really great advice, and hits home. And, on that note and that mark, I think it's a good time to, stop and just say that, I'm sure people that are listening and will listen got a tremendous amount. Me studying your work and me getting to know you even more today, we've talked a little bit before, has been an eye-opener, a life changer, and, affected me in a very positive way. And I know people that will listen to this too, we're going to share it with a lot of different people, and I'll talk to you about that online, who we're going to share it with. I want you to see it first. Are really going to garner and really, really learn a lot about from your work and your study and your many pivots in life. And with that, I want to thank you. I appreciate you being here today.
Yeah, my pleasure, Jeff. And hopefully our paths will cross again in the not too distant future.
It will. I'll reach out to you soon, man. Thank you.